All Bones Considered, Laurel Hill Stories number 69 for December 2024. 6 women of the R.M.S. Titanic. Eleanor Elkins, Widener Rice, Lily and Olive Potter, Gretchen Longley Leopold, Charlotte Drake Cardeza, and Anna M. Ward. Laurel Hill East is a National Historic Landmark, an arboretum, a sculpture garden, a nature preserve, and an active cemetery in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. It opened in 1836 and remains a popular visiting spot for tens of thousands of visitors every year. Its sister cemetery, Laurel Hill West, located across the Schuylkill River in Bala Cynwyd, was founded in 1869. It has a history and a population of its own. I am Dr. Joe Lex, retired professor of emergency medicine at Temple University in Philadelphia, volunteer tour guide at Laurel Hill East and Laurel Hill West, and volunteer podcaster. Laurel Hill has 12 passengers from the R.M.S. Titanic memorialized, 6 men and 6 women. At Laurel Hill East is a mausoleum for William Crothers Dulles, whose body was recovered, and cenotaphs in the Widener Mausoleum for George Dunton and Harry Elkins Widener, whose bodies were not recovered. Laurel Hill West ended up as the final resting place for 3 men who survived: Thomas Drake Martinez Cardeza, who's in the Drake Egyptian Revival Mausoleum in the Franconia section, and William Ernest Carter and his son William Thornton Carter, both in a mausoleum in the Ashlands section. But today's podcast is about the women, 6 of them who survived the watery tragedy, but with a Laurel Hill connection. And I was very lucky to get a few extra voices to help me. I'm going to start with the tale of cenotaphs for victims of 2 of the worst shipwrecks before the Titanic. We have cenotaph for 3 victims of the SS Austria catastrophe and 2 from the horrifying La Bourgogne disaster. They're commemorated by empty tombs with a memorial marker. I will also cover much basic information about the Titanic itself, and I will tell the story of Gretchen Longley, the loveliest woman aboard the ship. Longtime Laurel Hill tour guide Laura Lewis shares her extensive knowledge of the amazing Eleanor Elkins Widener Rice, whose husband and oldest son perished, and the force of nature known as Charlotte Drake Martinez Cardeza, who is returning from one of her frequent safaris with one of her servant girls and her son when the big ship went down. Finally, taphophile and podcast newcomer Savannah Fisher tells us of her 2 favorite passengers, Lily Potter and her daughter Olive, both of whom served their post-Titanic lives in the service of others. Their stories and much more in this month's All Bones Considered, Laurel Hill Stories number 69, 6 women of the R.M.S. Titanic. Introduction to 6 women of the R.M.S. Titanic. The term Davy Jones' locker dates to at least the early 18th century. 1726, author Daniel Defoe mentioned this mythical resting place of the oceanic abyss in his novel The 4-Year Voyage of Captain George Roberts. Many origin stories for this name Davy Jones have been proposed, including a real pirate named David Jones who plied his trade in the Indian Ocean in the 1630s, to a corruption of Jonah's survival in the belly of a great fish. Marine archaeologists estimate there are about 3 million shipwrecks at the bottoms of Earth's oceans, lakes, seas, and rivers. The number of drowned human beings is immeasurable, certainly in the millions. We know that about 1.5 million newly enslaved Africans died during the Atlantic crossing, and their bodies were tossed into the ocean. Between 1836 and 1914, more than 30 million immigrants left Europe and came to the United States. The death rate during passage was 1 fatality per 7 passengers, a little more than 14%. That's not that different from the African slave trade's fatality rate of about 15%. And most of those victims received a sea burial. Drowning still accounts for about 300,000 deaths annually worldwide. Most of the victims are from Southeast Asia and the Western Pacific Ocean. But in the United States, an average of 10 people drown every day. For more information about learning how to swim and prevent drowning, listen to Biographical Bites from Bala number 17, Swimming While Black. A cenotaph is an empty tomb. It's a way to keep a memory alive when a body is lost or destroyed or buried elsewhere, as was the case with so many American soldiers who were killed in defense of their country while in another land. We have several such cenotaphs at both Laurel Hill East and Laurel Hill West, pretty much from any war you can think of. They are mostly for victims of military conflicts. At least one cenotaph at each cemetery helps preserve memories of people whose bodies went to a watery grave as their final resting place. There's a gray obelisk. I'm going to say it's somewhere between 15 and 20 feet tall, not far from the gatehouse of Laurel Hill East in Section O. It's actually kind of close to the fence that separates you from Ridge Avenue. This commemorates the Vezin family, V-E-Z-I-N. Patriarch Charles Vezin, 1782 to 1853, was born in Lower Saxony, Germany. He's considered the father of the game of chess in Philadelphia. He set up the city's first chess club on the second floor of the Athenaeum. Charles married Emily Kalinsky, 1804 to 1858, and they had several children together. One of their sons was famed actor and elocution teacher Hermann Wesson, 1829 to 1910. September 13th, 1858, the steamship liner Austria is traveling from Hamburg to New York. Built in Scotland, the Austria was 318 feet long, 40 feet at the beam. It had 3 masts and a single-screw propeller propulsion. It carried mostly immigrants, although Philadelphian Emily Vezin, her son Alfred, and her daughters Mary and Clara were among the first-class passengers. Now, captains of 19th century transoceanic voyages feared disease as much as they feared icebergs. One solution? Fumigate steerage. That's where the lower-class passengers traveled. They must be the ones who carry the disease. Passengers were herded onto deck. The crew would shut the hatches and go below with buckets of pine tar and hot irons. They'd put the hot irons, red-hot irons, into the tar and wave them around, and the smoke would disinfect the living quarters. If that sounds dangerous and dirty, it was both. Someone on board the Austria made the decision to fumigate the ship's steerage area by using a red-hot chain that had been dipped into a bucket of tar. The chain got too hot for the boatswain to hold, and he dropped it onto the wooden deck, which at once burst into flames. The entire engine crew was soon disabled and then asphyxiated by smoke and toxic gases. And then the spreading blaze was fanned by Austria's forward speed. They had left the deck. They could not stop the ship. When the quartermaster was forced to abandon the helm, The ship swung into the wind, and flames spread down the entire length of the vessel. Austria's beautiful polished mahogany veneer, varnished bulkheads proved to be excellent fuel for the blaze. Passengers and crew soon began jumping into the sea. There was a passing French bark, Maurice, that rescued most of the survivors. Katarina, a Norwegian vessel, retrieved more victims the following morning. But as the blackened hull slipped under the waves a little more than halfway across the North Atlantic, most of her passengers and crew were dead of asphyxiation, drowning, or flame. Alfred Vezin, age 19, was one of the last off the boat, but his mother and sisters did not make it, and their bodies were not recovered. 3 years later, in November of 1861, Alfred was mustered in as a sergeant in the 15th Pennsylvania Volunteer Cavalry, also known as the Anderson Troop Cavalry. And less than a year later, he was promoted to captain of Company C, and he mustered out in May of 1863. Of Austria's 542 passengers, all but 89 were lost. The burning of the Austria became a popular topic for contemporary painters. There is surprisingly little about the Philadelphia connections of the Austria in local newspapers of the day, and I find no mention at all of Emily in biographical sketches of her famed husband or her sons. But don't worry, the names of Emily, Mary, and Clara Vezin will live on the Laurel Hill obelisk for centuries. Until the SS Atlantic tragedy in April 1873, there was no protocol for the now familiar mantra, women and children first. Of the 952 people aboard that doomed ship of the White Star Line, at least 535 died. The ship's manifest listed 156 women and 189 children, including 2 who were born during the voyage. Every woman and child perished, except for one 12-year-old boy. 10 crew members were lost, but 131 crew survived. Victorian sensibilities were shattered by this clearly non-chivalrous behavior from the crew, and a new philosophy was born. Henceforth, men would sacrifice themselves for the benefit of others. The Atlantic was the deadliest civilian maritime disaster in the North Atlantic Ocean until the sinking of the SS La Bourgogne on July 2nd, 1898. So far as I can tell, there are no Laurel Hill cenotaphs for victims of the Atlantic. The women and children first philosophy had apparently not taken hold by the time of the La Bourgogne disaster. When it was new in the 1870s, she had set a record for the fastest westbound transatlantic crossing from Le Havre to New York. La Bourgogne sank after she left New York City en route to Le Havre and collided with the sailing ship Cromartyshire. The two ships were in thick fog off Newfoundland, and Cromartyshire had reduced speed, but La Bourgogne was steaming at high speed. It was alleged that after the collision, some of the steamship's officers did not do their duty to minimize loss of life, and members of either her own crew or a group of sailors who were steerage passengers fought to save themselves to the exclusion of other passengers. Only 13% of the La Bourgogne's passengers survived, compared with 48% of her crew. Of the 200 women passengers, 1 survived. In one ghastly incident, 40 women got into a lifeboat. They could get no help to launch their vessel, and all 40 of those women drowned. Among the passengers were numerous children. Not one of them survived. Many survivors told horror stories of crewmen forcing women and children out of lifeboats at knife point. Most of the recovered bodies were interred in Halifax. 2 victims of this maritime tragedy, the worst to befall the White Star Line before the Titanic, are listed on a cenotaph at Laurel Hill West. Brother and sister Francis Penn Steele Jr., 1874-1898, And Gertrude Steele, 1881-1898, went down with La Bourgogne, and their names are on a ledger stone at Lansdowne 23. It's practically across the street from the Clothier plot in the Summit section. Francis Penn Steele Jr. was one of the principal actors in the Mask and Wig Club, where he served as assistant stage manager. He always took women's roles and was considered the most graceful dancer of the lot. He was also vice president of the University of Pennsylvania class of 1895. Their father, Francis Sr., was for many years president of the Southwark National Bank, vice president of the Pennsylvania Salt Company, and of the Franklin Fire Insurance Company. He had earlier been president of the American Academy of Music, stated director at the time of his death in 1893, when Francis Jr. was 19 and Gertrude was 12. They lived at 219 East Logan Square. This brings us to the R.M.S. Titanic, a British-registered four-funneled ocean liner that was built in 1912 for the transatlantic passenger and mail service between Southampton, England, and New York City. It was owned by the White Star Line. Its overall length, 882 feet, 9 inches, height, 175 feet, made it the largest ship in the world. In fact, this was the largest movable man-made object that had been created up to that time. It was propelled by 159 coal-burning furnaces, carried about 5,900 tons of coal, which provided power to 3 propellers and a total horsepower of 51,000. By size, it was only inches longer than the Olympic and the Britannic. The Britannic was supposed to be named the Gigantic, but they changed their minds at the last minute. They were all sister ships of the White Star Line. You probably noticed the White Star Line likes ship names that end in IC. Gigantic, Olympic, Britannic, Oceanic, Celtic, the accursed Atlantic. Its competitor, Cunard, preferred its ship names to end in IA. Lusitania, Mauritania, Persia, Umbria, Etruria, etc. Passenger accommodations were spread across 6 decks of the Titanic. From top to bottom, you had the boat deck, A deck, upper promenade, B deck, promenade, C deck, saloon, D deck, upper, E deck, and lower, F deck. First-class accommodations were amidships on the uppermost 4 decks, A through D. There was a lounge and a smoke room on the boat deck. There was a grand and spacious dining room on the saloon deck. Second-class accommodations were distributed to the starboard sides of the saloon and upper deck, the D deck and the E deck. Now, there were some distinct differences between first class and second class. A ticket for either class would provide you with luxuries that you would otherwise find only at a 5-star hotel. Massage lounges, Turkish baths, private dining, cloistered promenades, well-equipped weight rooms, gymnasium, best food you've ever had in your life, and several hundred people ready to fulfill your every wish. Now, third-class passengers, do not feel sorry for them. They were not slumming. For many of these immigrants, they were away from home for the first time, and even though they were tucked away in steerage, these were the finest accommodations and the best food they had ever seen in their lives. The profile of the 11-story tall ship was iconic, with its 4 majestic funnels, each about 165 feet high, with a rake of 2 inches aft for every 12 feet of height. In other words, a backward angle of 9.5 degrees. 4 funnels rather than 3, because it bragged of speed and power and safety. The Cunard Line's Mauritania and Lusitania had 4 funnels. Now, you may have heard that the 4th funnel was a dummy, a phony, a prop that merely augmented the ship's silhouette. But that rearmost funnel was practical as well as stylish. It ventilated air to and from the ship's medical compartment, the engine room, and the first and second class kitchens, and it served as a chimney for the first class smoking room fireplace. April 10th, 1912, the Titanic sailed from Southampton, England, bound for New York. It picked up more passengers in Cherbourg, France, 274 passengers, but it dropped off several people there. And more people at Queenstown, Ireland, which is now known as Cove, 120 passengers there. When you walked the decks of the Titanic, you could hear more than a dozen languages being spoken. Early transatlantic wooden steamships took more than 2 weeks to cover the breadth of the ocean. In the 1860s, when iron hulls, compound steam engines, and screw propulsion were introduced, the crossing times were reduced to 8 or 9 days. The golden age of ocean liner, the early 20th century, was when the crossing stabilized at about 5 days. The Titanic was scheduled for a 6-day crossing, during which it would pass through 5 time zones and gain 5 hours. From Daunt Rock, Queenstown, to Ambrose Life Ship, New York, Titanic had to travel 2,889 nautical miles at a cruising speed of 21 knots. Top speed was about 24 knots. This would take her 5 days, 17 hours, 34 minutes. Nowadays, when we fly through 5 time zones, it's a minor nuisance. We barely think about it. In fact, most clock adjustments are done automatically by our various electronic devices. But not when you're traveling at 24 miles per hour. On a westward oceanic crossing, one of the ship's officers oversaw keeping proper time by turning the clocks back 1 hour every night. The ship's first-class passenger list held the names of 323 passengers. Many of them were among the richest people in the country: Strauss, Guggenheim, Astor. But in addition to amenities, first class brought survival privilege. 63% of first-class passengers lived, compared with 42% of second class and 25% of third class. The only children who died were from third class. Of the 2,186 people aboard, 1,300 were passengers, 886 were crew members. 1,704, 78% were male, 460 were female. The male-to-female death rate was 9 to 1. 43 of the passengers were servants. Only 19% of the people on board were from the United States. 54% were from England. And of the 673 Titanic crew members who were killed, 535 lived in Southampton, the point of debarkation. These 535 dead Setonians left behind 239 widows, 533 children under 16, 42 children over 16, and 213 other dependents. In other words, Southampton, England, was devastated. The Titanic hit an iceberg at 11:40 p.m. ship time, Sunday evening, April 14th. It caused a noticeable jolt. Now, icebergs are commonly regarded as white, but when a melting iceberg becomes top-heavy and rolls over, it turns dark blue until all the water runs out of it. At night, icebergs that are undergoing this change are pretty hard to see. The iceberg that struck the Titanic was most likely one of these so-called blue icebergs. It wasn't visible until it was just a third of a mile away, and witnesses who testified at inquiries that were held following the disaster said that it looked dark as it passed the ship. The first response by the crew was lackadaisical. After all, this ship was unsinkable. Initial queries by passengers were met with the soothing, "Nothing to be concerned about, go back to bed." Only after careful inspection by the ship's captain, Edward J. Smith, and the architect, Thomas Andrews, Jr., did the danger become apparent. Smith and Andrews knew the ship was doomed, and they ordered evacuation. They also knew that they would die with their ship. The lifeboats were uncovered at 12:40 a.m., an hour after the collision. Distress signals were sent by telegraph, and 8 white Coston flares were fired from the doomed vessel at regular intervals. I talked about Martha Coston and her flares in an earlier episode of All Bones Considered, Laurel Hill Stories, number 11. It's entitled, She Invented What? Titanic had enough lifeboats to accommodate about a third of the ship's total capacity. If every lifeboat had been filled to the gills simply with passengers, they still could have only evacuated about 53% of the passengers on board on the night of the sinking. Now, the lifeboat shortage was not due to a lack of space. The Titanic had been designed to accommodate up to 64 lifeboats. It was not because of cost. The price of an additional 32 lifeboats would only have been about $16,000. That's a pittance compared to the $7.5 million that the company had already spent. The lifeboats were stored on the boat deck, Deck A, the topmost of the Titanic's 10 decks, all connected by stairs, ramps, corridors, and elevators. The deck was made of teak. It was divided into 4 segregated promenades: the officers' promenade, first-class area, engineers, and second-class areas. The bridge was at the forward end of the ship, in front of the Marconi wireless room, quarters for the captain and officers, and the wheelhouse. The Titanic's bridge was a partially enclosed deck house that held navigating equipment such as the ship's wheel and telemotor and engine control telegraphs. The boat deck, A deck, also featured first-class entrances to the grand staircase and gymnasium, which were located midships, the raised roof over the first-class lounge, and the reading and writing room. At the aft end was the raised roof to the first-class smoking room and the relatively modest second-class entrance. 16 lifeboats lined both sides of the ship and were stowed in chocks rather than hanging from the falls for the davits. Only one lifeboat drill had been conducted while the ship was docked, and that had been a farce. That was a cursory effort. 2 boats were lowered. Each was staffed by 1 officer and 4 men who rowed around the dock for a few minutes before they went back to the ship. The lifeboats were supposed to be stocked with emergency supplies. They had been partially provisioned. No lifeboat or fire drill had been conducted since the Titanic left Southampton. There had been one scheduled for the morning of Sunday, the 14th. It was canceled, allegedly because Captain Smith wanted to deliver one last Sunday service before he went into his full retirement at the end of the voyage. So for the first hour, many passengers did not take the order to get into the lifeboats all that seriously. They preferred the comfort and the warmth of the ship to sitting in a small exposed rowboat in the open seas. There'd been no lifeboat drills on the voyage. People didn't know what boats they'd been assigned to or how to get to those boats quickly in an emergency. Well, Captain Smith ordered his officers to put, quote, women and children in and lower away. First Officer William Murdoch was on the starboard side. Second Officer Charles Lightoller was on the port side, and they interpreted this order differently. Murdoch loaded women and children first, while Lightoller interpreted the order as women and children only. Lightoller lowered lifeboats with empty seats if there were not any women and children waiting to board, while Murdoch allowed a limited number of men to board if all the women and children had already embarked. This had a significant effect on survival rates of the men aboard the Titanic. Their chances of survival just came to depend on which side of the ship they tried to find lifeboat seats. Because without a lifeboat, your chances of survival were as close to zero as you could get. There were only a very few swimmers who were pulled living out of that 35-degree Fahrenheit water. Without experience in lowering these cumbersome vessels, the lifeboat's progress down the side of the ship was slow, difficult, and at times precarious. pulleys were covered in fresh paint. Lowering ropes were stiff. They stuck repeatedly as the boat was lowered in jerks. And remember, this boat is coming down more than 7 stories towards the water. Nobody was lost from the lifeboats as far as we know. The lifeboats did not tip over and dump people into the ocean as they were being lowered. When Philadelphians looked at their Morning Inquirer on April 16, 1912, they were confronted with the headline, 1,500 persons lost when giant Titanic sinks after colliding with iceberg off Cape Race. If you were a sports fan, you might have headed to the sports section, page 12. Find that the Phillies had played their 4th game of the season on Sunday the 15th away in Brooklyn, and they scored 8 runs before the Robins, who are also known as the Dodgers, could even send up their first hitter. It would be 100 years before the Phils could duplicate that feat by scoring 8 runs in the first inning before the other team got to bat. Again, it was a New York team. It was the Mets on September 20th of 2012. As more information streamed in from telegraphs and was printed in the papers, remember this is years before commercial radio was available, people scanned the lists of survivors for familiar names. Many Philadelphians were among them. 10 went down with the ship. The names of Widener, Thayer, Ryerson, Williams. A Widener valet named Edward Keeping. William Ernest Carter's chauffeur, named Augustus Henry Aldworth, accompanied them to the bottom of the ocean, along with passenger Carter's magnificent 25-horsepower Renault. If you have seen the James Cameron movie Titanic, you would recognize Carter's car. Carter and his son, William Thornton Carter II, survived the sinking. They're interred in a mausoleum in the Ashland section of Laurel Hill East. As men, they do not qualify for this podcast. Maybe eventually I'll do a podcast about the men of the Titanic also. One of the bodies of Philadelphians was recovered, and a small mausoleum in Laurel Hill East's south segment holds the remains of passenger William Crothers Dulles. The carved inscription on his crypt cover says, "Died from Titanic." George Dutton Widener and his son Harry Elkins Widener, who went down with the ship, have cenotaphs in their family mausoleum on Millionaire's Row. But 9 survivors of that awful night are interred at Laurel Hill, 3 at East, 6 at West. 6 of them are women, and it is their stories that we want to tell you today.
At East Laurel Hill Cemetery, stroll Millionaire's Row. There, just a few yards from the bridge linking south, you'll see 2 names synonymous with the Gilded Age of Philadelphia on 2 imposing mausoleums sitting on opposite sides of the road. Elkins and Widener, 2 families marked by great wealth and terrible loss. It has a happy beginning. Eleanor Blanche Elkins was born on September 21st, 1862, the youngest daughter of investor and founder of the Philadelphia Rapid Transit Company, William Lukens Elkins, and his wife, Maria Louisa Broomall. Educated at Philadelphia's finest private schools and a student at Vassar for 1 year, Eleanor was known as one of the most beautiful women in Philadelphia. She was 22 when she married George Dutton Widener, the son of her father's business partner, Peter A.B. Widener. The wedding, which took place on November 1st, 1883, at the Church of the Incarnation, was described by the press as one of the most brilliant weddings of the season. That marriage united 2 of the city's greatest fortunes and oldest partnerships. The couple's fathers held stakes in U.S. Steel, Standard Oil, and the American Tobacco Company. Together, they were on track to monopolize the traction car industry with streetcars in Philadelphia, Chicago, New York, Cincinnati, and Pittsburgh. But it was a beautiful marriage with a common love of society, philanthropy, and family. They would have 3 children, a son, Harry Elkins, named for his father's late brother, a son, George Dunton Jr., and a daughter, Eleanor, They were close to their extended family, and when PAB finished Linwood Hall, they joined him in the 110-room estate, sharing a second-floor bedroom. Connecting that bedroom and Eleanor's boudoir, a built-in jewel safe for her extensive collection, including a set of pearls then valued at $200,000. Eleanor was known throughout society for her jewelry, and George was a generous gift giver. In the fall of 1909, all of New York was abuzz with speculation over a set of pearls being matched by a Fifth Avenue jeweler, most likely Cartier, although the firm is never mentioned by name in the press. On December 22nd, the New York Times gave extensive coverage to the purchase of, quote, a fabulous string of pearls by George Widener as a Christmas present for his wife, formerly the beautiful Miss Eleanor Elkins, end quote. According to the report, a spokesperson for the anonymous jeweler said that, quote, this is the most costly string of pearls in the world and brought the greatest price of any pearl necklace anywhere, end quote. Costly indeed, around $750,000 to be precise. The newspaper went on to say that it was thought that Eleanor would premiere her new bauble at a ball given by her sister-in-law, Mrs. Joseph Widener, at the Bellevue Stratford Hotel in January 1910. The pearls, so valuable that Eleanor could not, by insurance contract, leave them unaccompanied or checked to a second safe, would always be seen around her neck in photos. While they probably did make an appearance at her sister-in-law's soiree, they possibly debuted when Eleanor and George hosted an epic coming-out party for the Widener's daughter at the same hotel, the Bellevue Stratford, on December 30th, 1909. The Inquirer reported that, quote, inclement weather delayed the entrance of many of the 1,800 guests, but the society columns went into raptures over the presence of so many East Coast grandees. The color scheme was a seasonal one of red and green, and the ceiling of the ballroom was hung with cornucopias filled with poinsettias, and from which confetti poured down onto the heads of the dancers below. Fresh flowers were everywhere, and rustic bowers of ferns and moss had been constructed around the floor, end quote. Daughter Eleanor would play a part in their fateful decision to visit Paris in the early months of 1912. She was engaged to Fitz Eugene Dixon, and Eleanor was in search of her only daughter's trousseau. She and George were also looking for art and furnishings for a Newport mansion, Miramar, they had commissioned from architect Horace Trumbauer. George was also looking for a chef, staff, and additional art and furniture for a new venture. He had built the first Ritz-Carlton in Philadelphia and needed to decorate and staff it. Why a Ritz-Carlton? Legend has it that one night the previous season, he and Eleanor were smoking within the lobby of the city's then best hotel when the manager approached his wife to inform her that ladies were not permitted to smoke inside the hotel. George bought the adjacent property for a Ritz in revenge. A third accompanied them on this extravagant shopping spree, their son Harry. Harry Elkins Widener was born January 3rd of 1885. His godfather was the British banking magnate Charles Mills, the second Baron Hillingdon. He attended the Hill School in Pottstown, Pennsylvania, where he took part in almost every aspect of student life, including the tennis team, the cadet corps, and the debating club. And he acted in a student production, A Scrap of Paper, playing a scientist whose most memorable moment came as he unknowingly used a crucial love letter to wrap a rare beetle specimen. He graduated from Harvard College in 1907, where he was a member of the Owl Club and the Hasty Pudding Theatricals, where he famously played Abadiah Burdock Butterworth, husband of a masterful woman, in the 1907 Hasty Pudding show, The Lotus Eaters. Harry began serious book collecting while an undergraduate at Harvard, possibly beginning with books on costumes through this membership in the Hasty Pudding Club. His collection contained thousands of colored engravings and elaborately bound multi-volume sets, covering a wide range of topics from the military costumes of Turkey to costumes designed for the Queen of England's state ball. He began his collection with first editions of the authors and artists he loved best, especially Charles Dickens, Robert Louis Stevenson, and Robert Cruikshank. He soon branched out to include other literary notables like William Makepeace Thackeray, Charlotte Bronte, William Shakespeare, and William Blake. He also collected original drawings and manuscripts. By age 25, Widener was ensconced in the book-collecting world of his day, belonging to the exclusive New York Grolier Club and the Bibliophile Society, and in close contact with Philadelphia bookseller Abraham Simon Wolfe Rosenbach and New York bookseller Luther Livingston. He expressed his philosophy of collecting in a letter to Livingston in May of 1910. Quote, "No matter how important a book or manuscript may be, I only want those which interest me." End quote. His collecting was supported by his grandfather and enthusiastically by Eleanor, who would make sure he woke each Christmas morning to new books for his collection. Christmas of 1911 brought over $18,000 in titles. In December of 1912, after the sinking, she would write to Abe and his brother Philip Rosenbach, thanking them for a printed tribute Dr. Rosenbach had produced, and then explaining, quote, "I must also thank you for the Christmas present you sent him. All his books were put in the room the same as each year. Whilst we could not see him, I know he was with us." End quote. It speaks of the solace that Eleanor found in Harry's collection and in continuing holiday traditions. At the time of his death in 1912, the Harry Elkins Widener collection consisted of approximately 3,300 volumes, missing only one, a rare 1598 edition of Francis Bacon's Essays, too special to ship home separately with the other items he had acquired during his book-buying trip. The small volume was with him when he boarded the Titanic. This collection would be augmented over the years by contributions from his family, including one of the few surviving copies of the Gutenberg Bible, which was added to the collection in 1944 by his brother and sister, George Widener and Eleanor Widener Dixon. The night of the sinking is well known. The Wideners, whose family held an interest in the White Star Company, hosted a dinner party in the restaurant a la carte in honor of Titanic Captain Smith. It was his last crossing for the company, as he would be retiring when they arrived in New York. Attending the dinner were Major Archie Butts, also being honored, and Philadelphia high society couples the Thayers and the Carters. After the dinner, the ladies retreated to the drawing room while the gentlemen headed off for cigars and cards. As with many of the first-class passengers, they were in disbelief that the ship was actually sinking. Eleanor was finally placed into Lifeboat 4 by her son and George, who handed her his ring, a round emerald set in a simple plain gold setting, promising he'd reclaim it in New York. Eleanor would later give this ring to her daughter, who in turn passed it to her son, Fitz Eugene Dixon Jr., who willed it to his daughter when he died in 2006. Unfortunately for the men on deck, Second Officer Charles Lightholder was in charge of loading the boat, and he believed that it was not women and children first, it was women and children only. Even if there had been room, and Colonel John Jacob Astor inquired, they would not be boarding a lifeboat. Eleanor was joined by the pregnant Madeline Astor, her maid Amelie Geiger, Lucille Carter and her children Lucille and William, and Emily Ryerson and her 13-year-old son John, who boarded only due to his father's and Colonel Astor's intervention. The boat was actually left hanging beside A deck for most of the night, taking on men and women from second class and not launching until 1:50 a.m. Passenger Emily Ryerson later testified, quote, "There was confusion of orders. We rowed towards the stern. Someone shouted something about a gangway, and no one seemed to know what to do," end quote. But there were no open gangway doors, and no passengers were waiting. Only two greasers who were standing near the empty davits of Lifeboat 16. These were Thomas Ranger and Frederick Scott, and the pair of them shimmied down the falls. Ranger made it directly into Lifeboat 4, but Scott fell into the water and was hauled in after 2 or 3 minutes. Lamp trimmer Thomas Hemming said he slid down a rope after all the boats had gone and swam 200 yards to Boat 4, where he was hauled in. 8 other crew members were dragged into the boat from the sea, including William Lyons and Sidney Siebert. The last 2 were so overcome with cold that Sidney died in the boat shortly after being hauled aboard, and Lyons died on the Carpathia on April 16th. With now more than 40 people on board, they received another 5 or 6 from Lifeboat 14, to which they had been attached. When 14 left them, they went, together with Lifeboat 12, to rescue those on Collapsible B and received another 6 or 8 people from that boat. They reached the Carpathia late, with perhaps 55 living survivors on board. Eleanor was in shock and suffering from a cold when she arrived in New York, where her father and brother-in-law were waiting, a special train commissioned to return her to Linwood. Harry's body was never recovered, and to add more heartbreak to his family, it was mistakenly reported that George had been found. An early missive from the recovery boat Mackay Bennett listed a George Wide on its manifest, and the Inquirer reported on April 27th that he, along with fellow Philadelphians East Laurel resident William Charles Dulles and Frederick Sutton, were recovered. Had he been found? The Mackay Bennett had only enough embalming supplies to bring back about 100 bodies, with first class having priority, in part because they would have insurance requiring a body, and their families would have the funds to bring them home. By law, if a body was not embalmed because of damage or lack of fluid, it was buried at sea. Could it be that George was found, either after they finished embalming, or he was too badly damaged and he was returned to the sea? His valet, Edwin Keeping, was found and identified by his clothing and effects, including a gold locket with photos of his wife, also an employee of the Widners, and his baby daughter. He'd be buried at sea with just his effects returning. Both Eleanor and Peter were deeply affected by the loss of George and Harry, and each undertook projects to remember them and Eleanor's rescue. Eleanor first established a trust for Mr. Keeping's wife and daughter. Then, along with Mrs. Astor and Mrs. Thayer, she presented a Tiffany gold watch to the captain of the Carpathia, Captain Arthur Rostron. Its inscription, quote, "Presented to Captain Rostron with the heartfelt gratitude and appreciation of 3 survivors of the Titanic, April 15, 1912, Mrs. John B. Thayer, Mrs. John Jacob Astor, and Mrs. George D. Widener." The watch, which originally sold for about $25, passed through the family before it went to auction in November of this year, 2024, selling for $1.97 million. With Peter, she refurbished the family's church of worship, St. Paul's Episcopal Church in Ogont's Elkins Park, adding Tiffany stained glass windows, one each in honor of George and Harry, joining the piece Peter had earlier dedicated to his late wife Hannah. She also donated $300,000 to Harry's undergraduate Hill School for a general science building in his honor. Peter would complete Harry's plans for his library, adding the volumes he wanted. But Eleanor insisted that she be the one to establish his true memorial, the Harry Elkins Widener Library at his alma mater, Harvard, to be designed by Trumbauer. 1915 was a watershed year for Eleanor. In June, she, along with her son George and the architect Trumbauer, attended the commencement ceremonies for the Harvard class of 1915. There she dedicated the Harry Elkins Memorial Library, now completed at a cost that far exceeded her original $3.5 million pledge. A stunning addition to the campus, her only stipulation was that it never be structurally altered. In fact, when an addition was absolutely needed, the school circumvented this order by connecting the new section through a window of the original construction. Rumors continue to this day that Eleanor made other requirements for the donation, that fresh flowers always be placed under her son's portrait, and that all graduates know how to swim, in the belief that her son could have been saved had he been a swimmer. Both are false. Harvard would place flowers in the library as a courtesy and tribute to Eleanor's generosity. And Harry knew how to swim. Because so many of the elite graduates would go on to military or naval careers, the Ivy League schools already required their students to learn how to swim. This was a graduation requirement that would come and go over the years. On that June day, Harvard got a library, and Eleanor a second husband. Sharing the stage with her at commencement was surgeon, geographer, explorer, founder and director of the Harvard Institute of Geographical Exploration, and curator of the South American section of the Peabody Museum of Archaeology and Ethnology, Dr. Alexander Hamilton Rice. A wealthy adventurer 15 years her junior, Dr. Rice came from Boston and was named for his grandfather, former Boston mayor, Massachusetts governor, and U.S. Congressman Alexander Hamilton Rice. He was a Harvard grad, both undergraduate and medical school, and his passion was the Amazon basin and its rivers. His explorations of the Amazon and Orinoco rivers won him honors which included, in 1914, the Gold Medal of the Royal Geographical Society, London, Gold Medalist, Geographical Society of Philadelphia, Gold Medalist, Société Royale de Géographie d'Anvers, and Gold Medalist, Harvard Travelers Club. If you've read David Grann's The Lost City of Z or seen its movie, you know that Dr. Rice was the rival feared and envied by fellow Amazon explorer Percy Fawcett. Grann noted, quote, "Despite the vastness of the Amazon, it seemed unable to accommodate all those explorers' egos and ambitions," end quote. Opposed in both approach and mission, Rice always had the upper hand, wealth to fund his explorations. In June of 1915, he had just returned to Harvard, having completed a year of service with the Paris surgical staff of the Ambulance Américaine, a group of American civilian doctors serving in Europe. The two, for lack of a better description, hit it off. In August, Eleanor dedicated Miramar with a lavish party attended by 500 of society's top tier and accompanied by Dr. Rice. By fall, the newspapers were at Twitter, speculating that a marriage was imminent. Eleanor was a newspaper dream subject. From her jewels to her hairstyle, she attracted the press. Vogue would catch Eleanor on the town. Quote, "In this rarefied set, again we find the resplendent Mrs. W," end quote. This time, it's her earrings that are specifically described. They were large black pearls, as was her necklace. They even treated their readers to a charming little sketch of the Titanic's most elegant widow. She was drawn in profile to show her new hairstyle, quote, "a low coiffure with a fringe on her forehead." The couple denied the rumors of an engagement while quietly making arrangements for a small ceremony on October 7th. But the cat was out of the bag, and the two eloped the day before. The New York Times reported, quote, "In order to avoid the publicity involved in the wedding in Trinity Church announced for tomorrow, Rice and Widener were married shortly after noon today in the vestry of Emmanuel Church." The couple found no difficulty in getting around the Massachusetts law requiring 5 days delay after securing the license, end quote. She wore her pearls. Upon her marriage, Eleanor gave up her Philadelphia home, and their life together was spent in Newport, in Paris, or in New York City. The Newport Summer Palace Miramar was a 27-bedroom, 14-bath mansion featuring a first-floor grand salon and ballroom, which opened onto a 4,000-square-foot oceanfront terrace. It boasted a 10,000-bottle wine cellar with a 20-foot stone basin for icing up to 200 bottles of champagne at once. The Parisian decorating firm Cardeza designed the interiors. The furnishings were purchased from Joseph Devine, 1st Baron Devine, a British art dealer who was considered one of the most influential art dealers of all time. The property includes a 6,000-square-foot carriage house and gardens designed by Jacques Grébert, with a bronze fountain designed by his father, the French sculptor Henri Léon Grébert. If you're interested, it last sold for $27 million in 2021. In New York, they resided in a townhouse mansion at 901 Fifth Avenue, also designed by Trumbauer and decorated by Carillon and dealer Duveen. In her 1937 will, Eleanor bequeathed the drawing room of that townhouse and its furnishings to the Philadelphia Museum of Art. Please note, Harry was not the only collector. Just as Peter Widener amassed his art, Eleanor here displayed one of the greatest collections of 18th century Vincennes Service porcelain, china figures so delicate that dust was not wiped off them, but whiffed away by a gently pumped bellow. The floor of the salon was covered by Savonnerie carpet, and the rooms filled by Boucher tapestries, Louis XVI paneling, rock crystal chandeliers, and 18th century French antiques valued at $3 million. In Paris, they resided in a townhouse at 22 Rue Barbet de Jouy, in the 27th arrondissement in the Invalides quarter. But there was one other home for the Rices, the Alberta, a boat on the Amazon River. Following their marriage, Eleanor outfitted this research ship with then state-of-the-art tech, including a hydroplane and a two-way radio. She and maid Amelie remember Amelie, would accompany him on several of his excursions beginning in 1916, expeditions that were closely followed by the press, who noted she was the first Western woman to visit the Rio Negro country, and she went, quote, further up the Amazon than any white woman had penetrated, end quote. Eleanor would help Rice ultimately map some 500,000 square miles of the Amazon basin. When not exploring South America, Alexander and Eleanor enjoyed a high society lifestyle. The April 1, 1916 edition of Vogue reported the couple were in attendance in Palm Beach. Quote, at the height of the season, on Saturday nights, the most beautiful and most prominent women in America congregate in the cool green and white dining room, and even an array of diamonds as here dazzles the eyes. As for pearls, Monte Carlo itself, it would seem, could show no more wonderful ones. Probably the most exquisite and valuable ones are those worn by Mrs. Alexander Hamilton Rice, the former Mrs. George Widener, end quote. Eleanor would spend the next 20 years with Rice, widely recognized for her generosity, especially for the American Red Cross and educational institutions. She now kept a low profile. When she passed on July 13, 1937, at the age of 76, following an embolism suffered in a Paris department store, headlines read, Alexander Hamilton Rice's wife has died. She left her estate, some $11 million, in trust for the benefit of Rice, to pass on his death to her surviving son George and her daughter Eleanor. He would remain at Miramar until his own death in 1956 at age 80. Wife, mother, philanthropist, and adventure, Eleanor was buried at East Laurel Hill Cemetery, joining the Widners in their massive mausoleum. There, next to cenotaphs to her first husband and son, she lies under the name Eleanor Elkins Rice. The end of the story? Not quite. A bit of Eleanor is still roaming the earth. While her jewel case and that $200,000 pearl necklace was lost to the sea back in 1912, one of her pieces made it off the ship. Found in the pocket of a male victim, probably family valet Edwin Keeping, it was a gold and enamel necklace. This necklace came under the care of producers of the traveling Titanic, the exhibition. In 2011, in its opening hours at Copenhagen's Tivoli Gardens, somebody made off with a necklace, and it's missing to this day. If you have any intel, Tivoli Gardens has a standing $1,000 reward for its return.
I'm sure that you have heard of Titanic at some point, from the movie or you did a lesson on it in history class. Either way, you have most likely heard of some of the more famous people that have traveled with the Titanic on its maiden voyage. Many of the first-class passengers that were on Titanic are buried at Laurel Hill Cemetery, located in the East Falls section of Philadelphia. One of those people would be Lily Potter, buried in Section J, Plot 106. Lily Potter was born in Michigan on August 15, 1855. Her parents, Seth W. Wilson, 1827 to 1911, and Martha A. Thompson, 1829 to 1922, had two other children, Maddie A. Wilson, 1852 to 1886, and Weil T. Wilson, 1859 to 1923. Lily moved to Philadelphia with her parents in 1870 when she was 15. In 1876, when she was 21, she met Thomas Potter Jr., 1850 to 1910, who was 26 at the time. The two got married the same year. My first thought when I found out that they were married the same year that they met was that I believed there was an arranged marriage or a marriage based on money, being that Thomas was fairly wealthy. But arranged marriages went away along with the 18th century, which makes that a less likely scenario, and there is no evidence that shows any indication of either of those things. Thomas Potter Jr. made his fortune as a manufacturer in the oilcloth industry. His father, Thomas Potter Sr., 1819 to 1878, started his own oilcloth works in 1840 with his business partner, James Carmichael. In 1849, Thomas Potter Sr. bought the Bush Hill property from Charles Henry Fisher and ran his company independent of Carmichael, who stayed on 3rd Street. Potter did very well at his new location, producing 1 million square yards of oilcloth, 1.5 million square yards of carriage cloth and furniture per year. Thomas Potter Sr. passed away in 1878 at his countryside estate. Thomas Potter Jr. followed in his father's footsteps and ran the oilcloth factory. Thomas Potter Jr. went on to join the National Guard in Philadelphia. He gained the rank of Assistant Quartermaster General on December 12, 1888, and held it for 3 years. On September 22, 1895, he rose to the rank of Colonel Quartermaster General and held that rank until his death in 1910. Thomas Jr. and Lily had 3 children: Thomas Potter III, 1877 to 1894, Wilson Potter, 1880 to 1946, and Olive Potter, 1888 to 1958. Thomas Potter III died in 1894, only living to see the age of 17. He contracted pneumonia that was said to have, and I quote, superinduced heart failure. Wilson Potter was a United States Army veteran serving in the Spanish-American War and World War I. He gained the rank of Lieutenant Colonel in the United States Ordnance Department. He was wounded in battle on November 3, 1918, while fighting in the Oregon Offensive during World War I. In 1909, Thomas Potter Jr. had fallen ill during the National Guard encampment at Gettysburg. He went to his cottage in Atlantic City and was contained there for the short remainder of his life. While hunting in Alaska, Wilson Potter had learned that his father would soon pass away. Wilson did everything in his power to reach his father in Atlantic City. He had arrived at the cottage before his father's passing. On December 2, 1910, Thomas Potter Jr. passed away with Lily, Wilson, and Olive at his bedside. In 1911, Olive's marriage to Bolton Earnshaw, 1880 to 1971, was crumbling, and Olive filed for a divorce. Back then, it was not easy to get a divorce, legally or socially. Divorce first became legal in Maryland in 1701, but it was reserved for the wealthy due to high costs. However, it was still seen as frowned upon until the early 1900s. Divorce was only carried out if there was proof that a spouse was at fault, as in cheating, abandonment, or violence. Olive most likely received a ton of backlash and zero support, but surely enough, her mother was by her side. Lily thought that with her being newly widowed and Olive caught up in divorce proceedings, that they should take a leisurely trip to Italy and the Middle East in December of 1911. They brought along one of Olive's longtime friends, Margaret Hayes, 1887 to 1956, who went to Briarcliff Elementary School with her. Margaret brought her Pomeranian dog named Lady along with her. While in Egypt, they crossed paths with Gilbert Tucker, 1880 to 1968, who was very interested in Margaret, so he spent a lot of time with the trio. Around April of 1912, the three were all done with their trip, and they had booked a return trip home on a different ship. They were in Turkey when they first heard about the Titanic and thought it would be an amazing ship to travel home on. So even though the ship wouldn't leave for another week, they booked 3 first-class tickets for the Titanic. Lily stayed in cabin C-50, while Olive and Margaret shared cabin C-54. Gilbert became the ladies' self-appointed escort and stayed in cabin C-53. Aboard the Titanic, the 3 ladies spent a lot of their time with each other, especially in the first-class lounge. Lily was experiencing some seasickness while on the voyage, even with the sea being as still and calm as it was. On Sunday night, all 4 of them ate dinner together and then headed for the lounge. They felt a temperature drop and decided to retire for the evening. They all headed back to their rooms and were getting ready for bed. Olive, Margaret, and Gilbert were already asleep, but Lily had not fully fallen asleep when the ship hit the iceberg around 11:40 p.m. The collision woke up Gilbert and curiosity got the best of him, so he went on deck. By the time he got there, the engine had already stopped, and Captain Smith was getting as many people as possible to help load and lower the lifeboats. Olive and Margaret also woke up and they went to Lily's room. Lily told the 2 girls to go out and see what was going on. They did as she asked and went out on the deck to see what had happened. They came back to the room and told Lily that they hit an iceberg, but a steward had told them that everything would be fine and to just go back to bed. They told her that they didn't believe the steward, and Lily agreed. Lily was very alarmed and had told them that they should definitely not stay in the room. Olive and Margaret were a little less frightened, but still a little startled. They talked about what to do for a minute, and they decided that they would prepare for swimming in the event that Titanic would go down. They did not wear their corsets because they felt that it would hold them back or prevent them from swimming. Lily later said that it was odd that she thought of such a thing, but it never occurred to her how cold the water would be. They gathered blankets, and Margaret wrapped up her dog. The girls headed for the highest deck, where they met Gilbert Tucker, who helped them put on their life vests before putting on his own. Contrary to popular belief, Titanic had more lifeboats than were required. The required amount for a ship that large in size was 16. The R.M.S. Titanic had 20. They only needed enough to hold about 1/3 of the ship, as it was not believed that everyone would have to evacuate the ship at once. Many people would say that the reason for Titanic ending so tragically was due to poor evacuation procedures, as the crew were not trained to load and lower lifeboats, and not many knew what boat they were assigned to. Lifeboat 7 was prepared to be placed on the water, and they called for women to come forward to get into the lifeboat. People were told that nothing was wrong, so many women decided not to get into the lifeboat. They were then told that the captain wanted to lighten the ship while repairs were being made. Without objection, Lily put herself, the girls, and the dog in a lifeboat. Luckily for Margaret, no one had an objection about her bringing her dog. They were lowering the boat with only about 15 people in it when they realized that they did not have enough people. Lily, Olive, and Margaret called for Gilbert to get a few other men and get in the lifeboat. At this time, the lifeboat was about 15 feet below the railing. Gilbert slid down the ropes and got in. Gilbert stated in an interview in the 1950s that as he slid down, he thought that he would be back in time for breakfast. They lowered the lifeboat at 12:45 a.m., and the men on board started rowing. While rowing, someone felt the water on their feet, and they realized that the drain was not plugged. Someone quickly plugged it up, and they kept rowing. Lily had gotten hungry and asked if there was any food on board. They looked around but did not find any. They were unsure how long they would be on the lifeboat, so this was probably a large issue. They rowed for about 1/4 of a mile as they watched the ship. They drifted through the water, and they saw Titanic begin to submerge into the water. They were thankful that they took the lifeboats. Lily describes that she remembers watching. After about 2 hours of rowing, the ship had been fully underwater. The rescue ship, the Carpathia, came by the time the sun rose. The Carpathia was working to rescue everyone from the lifeboats. When it was Lily's turn to climb up the rope ladder, her hands were too cold to hold on, so instead she sat in the rope swing and got pulled up. The group knew that they were among some of the luckier people to not have lost a member of their traveling crew. Immediately, they started helping people who had left their families and friends behind. For Lily and Olive, this would just be the start of assisting people who need a helping hand. Margaret volunteered to care for 2 young boys who spoke no English, only French, which Margaret was fluent in, and they were not yet claimed by an adult family member. Interestingly, it was later discovered that their father, Mitchell Navitral Sr., had accused their mother of having an affair, and while the kids were staying with him, they disappeared by the time their mother was coming to get them. The boys stayed at Margaret's house with the Children's Aid Society supervising until their mother was found and brought to America to get them. When the Carpathia docked at Pier 54 in New York, the 3 ladies met up with the rest of the Potter family, who were grateful that the ladies and Margaret's dog made it out alive. Gilbert met up with his friend before going to his relative's apartment. After being a part of and seeing firsthand such a horrid disaster, Lily and Olive began volunteering for the Red Cross 4 years later during World War I. Lily led the productions department, controlling many thousands of volunteers collecting and manufacturing materials that were needed overseas for the war effort. Lily spoke of how the productions department consisted of all ages, races, as well as all who wished to help their nation and be of service during the time of war disaster. This spoke measures to who she was as a citizen of our nation, being as diverse as it is. In 1920, Olive remarried Alan Crowless, 1889 to 1936. The two had 2 sons, Thomas Potter Crowless, who was born in 1924, and Alan Potter Crowless II, who was born in 1927. Olive and Alan and their kids continued to travel to places like Spain and even sailed to Bermuda multiple times. Lily, on the other hand, had a very different view of traveling and never took another ocean voyage after her experience on Titanic. She even stated in an interview, "You can't go through an experience like that without feeling like you have escaped an awful fate, and you should not risk the same again." Alan died in 1936 at age 47, making Olive a widow. In 1944, Lily was 88 years old and received the Gimbel Award of Recognition for 27 years of service with the Red Cross. On January 1st, 1954, when she was 98, Lily passed away in the home of Olive Potter due to heart failure. She was buried in East Laurel Hill Cemetery. In 1958, just 4 years after her mother, Olive passed away due to cancer on April 21st, 1958. She was survived by her 2 sons. Overall, Lily and Olive have a very inspiring story, going through disaster and going on to help out others who are going through something similar. They were both devoted caretakers and powerful women who I believe many people can learn a lesson from.
Take a brief break here to tell you about what's coming up at Laurel Hill. Things have calmed down a little bit for this season. We've still got 6 tours in the month, though, I think you'll have fun with. Sunday, December 8th at 1 p.m. at East. New tour. I'm looking forward to this one. Marty Foley is doing a tour called Oops, Let's Pretend That Didn't Happen. Oh, the possibilities. I can't wait to hear what Marty does with that. There's the introductory Hotspots tour on Saturday, December 14th at 10 a.m. at East. Rich Boardman is your host for that. And then Russ Dodge is doing his annual Laurel Hill Christmas tour. This year it is Saturday, December 21st at 1 p.m. Hotspots tour Friday, the 27th at 10 a.m. Pat Silverman is giving that. Saturday, the next day at 10 a.m. at West, Sacred Spaces and Storied Places. Sarah Hamill, a guaranteed great tour whenever you see the name Sarah Hamill. And then finally, we finish up the year at Laurel Hill on Tuesday, New Year's Eve at noon with our traditional champagne toast to General George Gordon Meade at his graveside. Show up for a lot of reenactors, people in Civil War uniforms, in Victorian costumes. It is truly a spectacle. Plus, you can share some ice-cold bubbly. Well, ice cold depending on the weather. There have been years when it's been ice cold. There have been other years when you shake your head and say, what month is this anyway? So look forward to that. Tuesday, New Year's Eve at noon, champagne toast at the graveside of General George Gordon Meade. If you are looking for a Christmas gift, last-minute Christmas gift, I wish I could say that the book that I'm working on would be ready. But let me spring this on you now. I've taken 52 scripts of the 100 or so podcasts that I've done, 52 scripts of women of Laurel Hill, and I'm turning them into a book with illustrations by one of our young Taphophiles, Chris Wilhelm, son of Rich Wilhelm, one of the tour guides. Chris is also an artist. Chris is kind enough to do illustrations for this book, 52 Laurel Hill Women. I hope it will be ready by this time next year, so you can include it as a Christmas gift. If you're looking for a fun, local, entertaining Christmas gift, I'm going to recommend a book based on another podcast. Peter Schmitz has become a friend over the last few years, and he did something similar to this. He took information from his podcast and other sources, and he's turned them into a marvelous book called Adventures in Theater History, Philadelphia. There are so many Laurel Hill connections in this book, I can barely begin to mention them. He talks about Mrs. Penfield's disaster in Fioretta. He talks about Anne Francine. He talks about William Wood and so many other people that you've heard about on my podcast. Well, he's talked about them in his podcast also, and he's put them in his book. Okay, let's get back to our podcast and hear about more women of the Titanic. Gretchen Fisk Longley Leopold, 1890-1965. The prettiest girl on the Titanic. Have you ever heard of Hudson, New York? Not the river, but the town on the east bank of the river. It's about 120 miles from New York City. Less than 6,000 people live there now, but in the early 19th century, it was the 4th largest city in the state, after New York City, Albany, and Brooklyn. A local lawyer named Levi Fisk Longley served as mayor in 1891-92. Levi was the 5th of 6 children born to Dr. Samuel Munson Longley of New Hampshire and Lydia Ann Fisk of Providence, Rhode Island. Young Levi attended the state schools. He took a 3-year course at Bradbury's Classical Institute, a renowned preparatory school. The intention was that he would matriculate to Brown University in Providence. But before he began his studies at Brown, he was offered the opportunity to study law at the offices of Robert Emmett Andrews, and he was admitted to the bar when he turned 21. 3 days later, he entered partnership with the Honorable Theodore Snyder, who was at this time the city recorder for Hudson. When Snyder left Hudson City, Levi went into law partnership with his brother, John B. Longley. They practiced under the name of J.B. and L.F. Longley. 1866, Levi was made deputy county clerk for Columbia. That was a post that he occupied until 1876. And then he was nominated by the Democrats for county clerk, a post that he held for some years. January 6, 1885, he married Mary Dear Andrews, the daughter of his preceptor in Hudson. More than 5 years later, one child, Gretchen Fisk Longley, was born to them on September 1st, 1890. It was the next year he was chosen mayor, but nearing the end of his second term as mayor, and married only 8 years, his wife, Mary Dear, died in December 1892 after a short bout of pneumonia. She left a grieving widower and a 2-year-old daughter. Levi and Gretchen moved in with her maternal grandparents, Robert Emmett Andrews, 1819 to 1901, and Matilda Scudder Fonda, 1821 to 1911. That was in Hudson. 1895, Levi was elected as county judge, and he served for 6 years until 1901. But in 1902, his health deteriorated, and on Sunday, July 8th, he died from, quote, neuralgia of the heart, end quote. In his will, Judge Langley appointed his sister-in-law Cornelia T. Andrews as guardian for the 12-year-old Gretchen. Cornelia, with a K, was his wife's sister, thus she was also the daughter of his longtime mentor and friend, Robert Emmett Andrews. Levi left $1,000 to his own sister, Maria Louise, $100 to his sister Anne Frances, $100 to his brother Eugene Ashton. Everything else went to Gretchen. Gretchen went to Boston Ladies' School, where she presumably boarded. At her father's insistence, she learned to row a boat, which would later come in handy. At age 21, she was striking, quite tall, 5'8", blue eyes, long brown hair. Her beauty was under the watchful eyes of Aunt Corny and another aunt, Louisa Hogeboom. And they were thrilled when Gretchen fell in love with a young physician, Raymond Sylvester Leopold. He was 7 years her senior. The aunts decided to treat Gretchen to a European trip so they could shop for her bridal trousseau. They spent a few months in Italy and France. Then they booked a voyage home on the White Star Line's R.M.S. Titanic. They boarded at Cherbourg under ticket number 13502. That had cost £77. With inflation, that's more than £11,000 in today's money. Gretchen occupied cabin D9, a corner room. The D-deck was located about 10 meters above the water line. It was the lowest of the first-class decks. Louisa Hogeboom occupied cabin D11. Cornelia Andrews got D7. While their rooms were not as expensive as some of the other first-class decks, £77 was a significant expense, but they lived in luxury. They were treated like royalty. Men took note of the gorgeous Gretchen, and when she entered the grand ballroom on the first night, the band leader had the band strike up, "Oh, You Beautiful Doll." Shortly after she boarded, Gretchen opened a farewell letter when she arrived in her cabin. It was a good wish for each day of the voyage. Good weather, refreshments, every desire, Tommies to burn, chocolate ice cream, heavenly evenings, entire meals, no regrets. I hope you notice that the first letter of each of those phrases is an acrostic for Gretchen. When the ship hit the iceberg just before midnight, Gretchen was jarred awake. Aunt Corny had not been feeling well. She was sitting up and reading. When Gretchen asked what the bump was, Cornelia said, We must have struck an iceberg. Go ask the steward if we're in any danger. Well, 3 times Gretchen went out to ask if there was any danger, and twice she was reassured by stewards that everything was fine. But she did notice in the hall outside their rooms there were some ice crystals which had come in through a porthole. Cornelia started to get nervous. She insisted that the trio make their way up to the boat deck, so they threw fur coats on over their nightgowns. Gretchen's was sealskin. Years later, her daughter wore it during inclement weather. It was about this time that the chief steward told them, you better put on a life belt as a precaution. They reached the main deck. The crew was filling lifeboats. There were partly dressed men and women running around with half-filled suitcases. Gretchen later said, when I saw the registered mail and the bread and water placed in the lifeboats, I thought to myself, I'm going to have an interesting story to tell when I get home. A great many women were reluctant to get into the lifeboats because they'd been convinced the ship was unsinkable, and they felt they'd be safer aboard the Titanic than in a lifeboat. Well, the third boat had room for Gretchen, but she refused to go without her aunts. Several minutes later, the 3 women left together from the port side in Lifeboat 10, the fourth and last lifeboat to leave from that side of the ship. Gretchen again. The ropes were new, and we went down the whole 80 feet lopsided. When we hit the water, they yelled at us from above to get as far away from the ship as we could. A Canadian girl and myself did the rowing. The only men with us were a pair of waiters. All those people in the water pleading to be picked up. There'd been a lot of honeymoon couples aboard, and they wouldn't let them stay together. People were just torn from each other. The brides were yelling to their husbands, grab a chair or something to keep afloat. In this lifeboat, there were 7 or 8 ladies from first class, 15 or more from second class, 10 or 12 from third class. There were also 4 crew members, so a total of about 40 people in a boat that was built for 65. Now, this is Aunt Corny recalling. When we got out on the water, we realized that the crewmen had only claimed they could row, only for the purpose of saving themselves. My niece had to take an oar. In a boat alongside ours, a sailor lighted a cigarette, and he flung the match carelessly among the women in our boat. We screamed with protest, to which he replied, we're all going to the devil anyway, it might as well be cremated now as then. The crewmen on their boat were waiters. They knew nothing of rowing. So Gretchen put her youthful training to use, and she pulled an oar until she was exhausted. About 2 a.m., they saw the Titanic's boilers explode about a mile away. The ship's lights went out, and then the Titanic broke in 2 and disappeared. Gretchen said that the shrieks were blood-curdling. About dawn, the R.M.S. Carpathia appeared on the horizon. After 7 hours in the water, Gretchen's lifeboat reached the rescue ship. The women were assisted up the rope ladder. Their frozen hands and feet were unable to get them to the deck. They had ropes tied around their waists. Gretchen reported, 2 girls I had been to school with in Boston, nieces of Booth Tarkington, the author, watched as I was brought up. They told me it was like seeing someone rise from the dead. Their hands and feet thawed out quickly. Their throats stayed hoarse with cold. They refused a stateroom. Other survivors were in worse shape, and they needed it more. They slept in a lounge for the rest of the voyage and only got a stateroom on the last night at sea. 8 days after the disaster, the women were back in New York. The Newark Evening News reported in an article headlined, "3 Still Suffer from Perils and Cold," that the women were safely in the home of another of Gretchen's aunts, Mrs. Arthur H. Flack of East Orange, New Jersey. All 3 were still hoarse from the cold and were not able to speak above a whisper. Gretchen answered the reporter's questions and told this story. The most pathetic thing I heard was that on one of the boats, a collapsible lifeboat holding 16 to 20 persons, The party were up to their knees in water for 6 hours, so that one man had his legs frozen, and 8 died. The 8 were thrown overboard to lighten the boat and to keep it from being swamped. My impression is the Titanic struck an obstruction at 11:40 and sank after about 2 hours. There was ice all around us. I can never begin to tell of the feeling which came over us when we saw the Carpathia approaching in the gray of the early morning. It was about 8 o'clock, I think. Gretchen also claims that she saw Captain Smith commit suicide. Captain Smith made 2 attempts to kill himself, and at last he succeeded. He was in his library when the officers saw him with a revolver in his hand. They rushed to their superior officer and tore the gun from him. The captain struggled with them desperately, broke away, rushed to the bridge, where he killed himself, placing the revolver to his mouth and firing. Other witnesses state that Captain Smith drowned himself by jumping out of a lifeboat he'd been forced into. And most people simply say he went down with the ship. Aunt Corny was upset at material possessions they lost, and they took actions against the White Star Line. She filed a claim for fur coats, numerous dresses, 3 brass antique lamps, and, quote, 1 velvet hat with ostrich plumes. A total $480.50. In October 1913, 18 months after the Titanic sank and more than a year after the planned wedding, Gretchen Longley finally married Dr. Raymond Leopold at the Dutch Reformed Church in Hudson. It was followed by a reception at their home. Dr. Leopold was from Allentown, but he graduated from Germantown Academy in 1902. He was class historian and editor of the monthly magazine Academy. He graduated from Hahnemann Medical College in 1906, and then he spent a year there as an intern. Dr. Leopold initially went into practice with his brother, but he continued his studies in Europe, and he opened a surgical practice at Shelton Avenue and Morris Street in Germantown. He also became chief pathologist of the Women's Homeopathic Hospital, and he was on staff at both Hahnemann and Children's Hospital. During the Great War, he was a Navy surgeon aboard the hospital ship Mercy. 3 years after they were married, Gretchen sailed to Bermuda, quote, just to see if I could do it, end quote. She ultimately would cross the Atlantic 13 more times by boat. Gretchen and Raymond had a son and 2 daughters during their 44-year marriage. Raymond rose to be executive vice president of the Hahnemann Medical College and Hospital. He was also a trustee of Germantown Academy, the Germantown Historical Society, and the West Side Presbyterian Church. He retired from active practice in 1947, and they moved into the Emlyn Arms apartment at the Emlyn in Germantown. When he died in 1957, his body was interred at Laurel Hill West in the Washington section. After Gretchen raised her children, she ran an antique shop at 8127 Germantown Avenue. She rarely talked about the Titanic, but was always willing to answer questions from curious family members, especially her grandchildren and nieces and nephews. Even after Raymond died, Gretchen continued her adventurous ways. In August of 1965, she was in her stateroom aboard the liner USS Constitution on cruise in the Mediterranean when she died at age 75. She's buried next to Raymond at Laurel Hill West. Aunts Cornelia and Louisa are buried in Hudson, New York's Cedar Park Cemetery.
Bon vivant, world traveler, big game hunter and yachtswoman, big-hearted, Charlotte Drake Martinez Cardeza. Commanding, nouveau riche, ostentatious, opinionated, also Charlotte Drake Martinez Cardeza. Perhaps nobody aboard the Titanic was so pigeonholed and yet indefinable as the Germantown, Pennsylvania heiress. Charlotte believed in luxury and enjoyed it. With her 36-year-old son Thomas, his valet Louis Lesieur, and Charlotte's maid Annie Ward, she booked the most opulent suite aboard the Titanic, staterooms B51, 53, and 55, a ticket that cost Charlotte $3,200. They boarded at Cherbourg on April 10th. And who did she find? Wealthy families, traditional Edwardian women, old money, perhaps a few xenophobic Anglos who took notice of her Spanish surname. They perhaps looked down on her despite her great wealth, her devotion to charitable causes, and a husband who was descended from Portuguese nobility. There are a number of obnoxious, ostentatious American women, Massachusetts artist Frank Millet wrote of some of his fellow travelers in a letter posted at Queenstown. To him, these women were, quote, the scourge of any place they infest, and worse on shipboard than anywhere, end quote. At 58, Charlotte was youthful and athletic, her clothing fashion-forward and impeccable. Self-assured and confident, independent and direct, she exuded an air of the future modern woman. Today, she's mostly remembered as a caricature in Titanic plays and the woman who filed a 20-page itemized insurance claim against the Oceanic Steam Navigation Company. So, who was Charlotte? Charlotte Lottie Wardell Drake was born April 10, 1854, the daughter of Leeds, England-born textile entrepreneur Thomas Drake and his American wife Matilda. Thomas had come to America in 1828 with his parents and brother James, settling first in Steubenville, Ohio, where the family worked in the mills. Marrying Matilda McChesney in 1832, he moved first to Babylon, New York, then to Philadelphia, where he hoped to find more opportunity. In 1837, with his brother and a few other partners, he opened his first mill under the name T. Drake & Company in Manayunk, producing Kentucky woolen jeans and other similar apparel. By 1840, he was on his own, opening new mills and manufacturing cotton and woolen goods, as well as those popular jeans. He became director of the First National Bank, treasurer of the Coal Ridge Improvement Company, was the largest stockholder in the Fidelity Trust Company, and was a founder of the Union League. By 1860, he'd amassed his fortune and he retired, building a stately home in Germantown named Montebello. Sitting on 7 acres, the estate included botanic gardens, dog kennels for the 70 Great Danes they bred, and the city's largest private petting zoo with wandering elk and bison. Of Thomas and Matilda's 7 children, 5 died in childhood, and Charlotte's 19-year-old sister Clarissa died just after the families moved to Germantown. She was an only child now. Thomas, an enthusiastic big game hunter, included his only daughter on trips to India and Africa, where they hunted and captured animals to domesticate for the family zoo. Charlotte became a skilled markswoman. She was the first woman to track big game in India, a distinction that made the press. Charlotte was also a woman of many tastes, a connoisseur of the arts. She loved attending the opera from her private box and visiting the great museums and galleries around the world. In 1874, she married attorney James Warburton Martinez Cardeza and welcomed their son, Thomas Drake Warburton Martinez Cardeza, the following year. The young couple lived with her parents, where their son lived an extravagant lifestyle, including big game hunting. In 1890, Thomas Drake died, and after several sizable charitable gifts, he left his fortune and estate to Charlotte. She would not enjoy her new circumstances for long. James began an affair with a young actress, Cecile, who would have their child, Carlos Martinez Cardeza. Charlotte divorced him, although they remained friends throughout their lives. In fact, it was James who would meet Charlotte and his son in New York after the Titanic sinking. But now a free woman, Charlotte purchased lodges in Maine and Colorado, where she tracked deer and elk. She bought an ocean-going yacht, Eleanor, and set out to see the world, often with her now young adult son in tow. The Eleanor could handle 16 guests, and skipper Charlotte employed 39 crew members for her adventures. So what's more surprising, her cruise to Japan or her trip to Maine, where she bagged nearly 36 caribou and sailed them all home on the Eleanor? In the meantime, Thomas was acquiring a reputation of his own as a skilled lion hunter. The newspapers would often cover his adventures in Africa. Thomas also acquired something else, a wife. To her great surprise, Charlotte found out, through a letter, that Thomas had married more than a year earlier and was taking his new wife on her first safari to India. Marie Racine. Her father was a Swiss shopkeeper who'd brought his wife and teenage daughter to Philadelphia in 1894. Although she was a working-class girl who took a job in a department store, she was a direct descendant of dramatist Jean-Baptiste Racine, and she could speak fluently in 5 languages. Despite her low social status, she was courted by many wealthy young suitors. But it was Thomas who won her heart. And Charlotte? She too found Marie to be a wonderful, warm-hearted woman who could temper Thomas's flamboyant nature. Charlotte began to spend more time in Europe visiting with the young couple and joining them on numerous hunting expeditions. In 1906, Thomas and Marie settled at Widener, a castle estate in what was then Austria-Hungary. It boasted 50,000 acres of adjacent forest, and the couple built hunting lodges around the property for their noteworthy, bold-faced friends who would come for private shooting parties, including Teddy Roosevelt. Charlotte was staying with them in 1912 after a long shooting season in Africa when Thomas's health began to decline. Consulting doctors recommended he seek treatment in the United States. Charlotte had already booked her tickets home, and she encouraged Thomas to return with her on the Titanic. Marie stayed behind to manage the lodges. The two traveled to Cherbourg, where they and Charlotte's 20 pieces of luggage boarded the great ship. You could open up one of her Vuitton, Goyard, or Innovation trunks to find the most expensive furs: ermine, chinchilla, silver fox. She also had mink, moleskin, squirrel, seal, and baby lamb. Her diamonds and other jewels were from Tiffany. There were veils and feather pieces for her hats, many of which were made by Valette of Paris. Among her dozens of pairs of shoes were a purple satin pair, as well as a pair of green evening pumps with stockings to match, and a pair of light blue satin slippers with their own matching stockings. Charlotte's tailored suits, afternoon dresses, dinner gowns, evening cloaks, sports attire, and lingerie were exquisite. She could afford the best in fashion, and she had it. In London, she went to Lucille. In America, her favorite shops included Lord & Taylor, Saks, B. Altman, and Wanamaker's. In Paris, couture houses Redfern and Ruth, as well as the Bon Marché shops. Charlotte never spoke publicly about the sinking. What we know about her experiences comes secondhand. On the night of April 14th, her son hosted a card party on their private promenade deck. His guests including Broadway producer Henry B. Harris and his wife Renee. By 11:40, when the ship and the iceberg collided, the group was already in bed. Awakened by the collision, they went on deck to investigate, but were told by crewmen there was nothing wrong, to return to their cabins. Charlotte was taking no chances. Not bothering to dress for maybe the first time in her fashionable life, she covered her pink-trimmed white lawn nightdress with a motor coat, urging Annie to hurry up and go. Annie threw on one of Charlotte's coats, grabbing souvenirs, including 2 salt shakers from the nightstand, and stuffing them into her pockets. She would later tell her mistress about the items and be told to keep them. Annie would share her recollections with a Philadelphia Inquirer reporter. Quote, "We were ordered into a lifeboat. Mrs. Cardeza, Mr. Cardeza, his valet, and myself were placed in one of the largest lifeboats and sent away with a number of women and crew to row." End quote. Thomas Cardeza remembered that, quote, "It was not until the lifeboat was in the water that the portholes in the bow were underwater. Those portholes were about halfway up the side of the vessel, but when we started to pull away from the Titanic, the lights were clearly shining from under the surface of the sea." End quote. Thomas also spoke of seeing the little page boys being marched to their posts to await their fate. Charlotte, Thomas, Annie, and Louis made their way up the main staircase to the boat deck as they'd been instructed, and they waited with the others in the cold and noise of the starboard side. 2 lifeboats were soon loaded and lowered, and when an officer called for people to enter Boat 3, the Cardezas and their employees stepped forward. Were Thomas or Louis challenged on boarding? Depending on who was manning the station, men were allowed to enter lifeboats if there were no more women and children ahead of them. Charlotte did tell the officers that her son was ill and headed for treatment in Philadelphia, though. Lifeboat 3 was lowered the 50 feet to the water at 12:55 a.m. Built to hold 65 occupants, it carried just 32. And several of them complained about their fellow passengers afterwards. Daisy Corning Stone Spedden mentioned an irritating woman, a fellow first-class passenger, who kept ordering people around. Elizabeth Schutz spoke of 2 men who continued smoking cigars after they were asked to stop. Was it Charlotte, her son, and valet Louis? Mrs. Spedden described her irritant as fat, and while Charlotte had a roundish face, she was not particularly heavy. Could Charlotte, who was used to being in charge, been trying to just be of service? Annie just recalled that Charlotte held her hands throughout the ordeal. Whatever happened in the lifeboat, Charlotte managed to obtain the number 3 off the boat. It now resides in the Thomas Jefferson Archives. After their return to New York, Charlotte and Thomas would stay in the city while Annie returned home to her mother in Chestnut Hill. Suffering from shock, she still pulled herself together to care for Charlotte until she was strong enough to return to Montebello. Thomas would spend some time in New York receiving his treatment before returning to his mother's home. Charlotte's insurance claim ran to 20 pages and totaled more than $177,000. Single-spaced 20 pages. She and other passengers sued the owners of the White Star Line for negligence for sending a vessel to sea with ignorance of ice warnings and for other acts. What they didn't realize was that there were no rules governing passenger ships at sea at that time. No negligence was found on the part of White Star and its owners. With its limited liability, the claimants were forced to share a total of just $544,000. Charlotte's share of that settlement was only $8,750. In 1914, war came to Europe, and Thomas volunteered his services as Undersecretary to U.S. Ambassador Frederick Penfield. Marie enlisted as a nurse and was appointed the head of a Red Cross medical unit stationed in war-torn Poland. For her humanitarian work, she was awarded the War Order of Franz Joseph by the Austrian Emperor in 1917. Exhausted, she returned to the U.S. to join Thomas at their New York home. Together, they continued their humanitarian work, Marie being appointed secretary to the New York State Bureau of Industries and Immigration, where she helped prepare up to 3 million Polish immigrants for U.S. citizenship. The world was never the same for Charlotte. After the sinking, she curtailed her travel. She now spent her time traveling the United States. In San Francisco, she often stayed at the St. Francis Hotel, where she was doted on by the staff. She often visited Hawaii with Annie Ward by her side, and she enjoyed stopping at Yosemite for its quiet peacefulness. None of the Cardezas fully returned to hunting. Sightseeing became their travel motivation. Charlotte continued to improve Montebello, but her neighborhood was changing. Many of the large estates were being torn down, making way for subdivisions and commercial use. When the property next to Montebello was being subdivided, she installed a large 7-foot-high wall to seal off her estate. Her son and daughter-in-law were now spending more time in the U.S., mostly in Miami, Florida, where Charlotte tried visiting, but decided Florida was not for her. Travel was soon behind her. Rheumatoid arthritis in her knee left her unable to walk, and she retreated to Montebello. Thomas spent more and more time with her, especially after his father passed and he was coming to Philadelphia to help with his half-brother's family. Marie's mother also passed, and she too spent more time in Philadelphia. Charlotte was delighted to have her children close. They installed an elevator at Montebello and a movable seat in her Pierce Arrow to help her get in and out of her car. In her final years, Charlotte was surrounded by her son and daughter-in-law and a loving staff. George Craig and his family had moved on to the estate in 1911 to maintain the property, and he had named his son and daughter after Thomas and Charlotte. And Annie Ward, who married an estate gardener, remained close by. Annie would receive a surprise present from Charlotte, the nightgown she'd worn in Lifeboat 3. Her niece would later offer it at auction, fetching over $40,000 for it. But was she any less feisty or determined? After rounds of letters of complaint about her neighbors on the second level of Millionaire's Row at East Laurel Hill Cemetery, she removed her father, his Egyptian-style mausoleum, and her family to an open corner lot at West Laurel Hill, where its bare-breasted sphinxes could get the attention they deserved. Charlotte spent her last year in and out of Chestnut Hill Hospital, and sadly, Marie had developed a blood disease that was only mildly controlled by available treatments. The Cardezas became friends with hematologist Harold Jones at Thomas Jefferson University, who believed that better treatments were possible with the proper facilities. Charlotte passed away at age 75 on August 1st, 1939. Services were held at Christ Episcopal Church, and she was interred beside her parents and siblings at West Laurel Hill. Her will included bequests for Chestnut Hill Hospital and the SPCA, the balance going to her son. He used the inheritance to establish the Charlotte Drake Cardeza Foundation for Hematological Disorders at Jefferson University. And it is there today as part of the university hospital system.
I eventually do a podcast about the Titanic men and Laurel Hill connections, I will tell you about Logan Howard Smith, who wrote the first book about the Titanic under the pen name Logan Marshall. And Philadelphia, he's buried at Laurel Hill East. And then Philadelphia artist Colin Campbell Cooper, who was a passenger on the Carpathia, who gave up his suite to survivors. He's buried at Laurel Hill West. For the mid-December edition of Biographical Bites from Bala, Laurel Hill West Stories, number 39, I'm going to tell you a fascinating story about the first American deaf man to graduate from a hearing college. He then went on to become the first deaf Episcopalian minister in the United States, Reverend Henry Sile, whose sign language sermons became legendary among the hearing and the non-hearing alike. Sile is now recognized as a saint of the Episcopal Church, and he's interred under a modest stone at Laurel Hill West in the Summit section. In January's All Bones Considered, Laurel Hill Stories number 70. We're going to have a 200th birthday party for 8 markedly different Laurel Hill residents, all born in 1825. Laura Matilda Thompson, abolitionist and a homeopath who taught freed black children. Edward Henry Fittler served as mayor of Philadelphia. He has the tallest obelisk at Laurel Hill East. Henry Charles Lee was a publisher and medieval scholar who wrote the definitive work on the Spanish Inquisition. Richard Rush came from a distinguished family, was founder of the famed Rush's Lancers during the Civil War. Mark Richard Muckla was an animal rights activist. And despite his hyper-patriotic name and being the grandson of George Washington, George Lafayette Washington was a traitor to his country as a member of the Virginia Cavalry and Mosby's Rangers. John Rowe had the misfortune to be an inpatient at Bloxley Almshouse when a fire swept through the building and took Rowe and many other victims to their deaths. And Dr. Thomas Craycroft volunteered to go to Virginia and help with a yellow fever epidemic, but he paid for it with his life. 8 fascinating people, all buried at Laurel Hill East, who are celebrating a 200th birthday in 2025. We will wish them a happy birthday in January. Laurel Hill East is located at 3822 Ridge Avenue in the East Falls section of Philadelphia. It's an easy walk from the bus stop at Ridge and Allegheny for SEPTA buses R1 and 61. Admission is free, as is parking in the lot across the street, although spaces are rather limited. You can pull into the ground. You can park where you know you won't be blocking anyone. There's also an app that you can download for a self-guided tour through its 78 acres. Laurel Hill West is at 225 Belmont Avenue in Bala Kidwood. There's parking at the main entrance and at the bell tower. Public transportation, take the SEPTA Regional Rail to Manayunk or one of the many buses to the Wissahickon Transfer Center on Ridge Avenue, which looks like it's almost completed. The Transfer Center, they've been working on it for a couple of years. It'll be nice to have an indoor place to wait there. I make a lot of transfers there. Anyway, once you get off at the Wissahickon Transfer Center, you can cross the Schuylkill River on the Pencoid pedestrian bridge, come up Writers Ferry Road to the entrance near the Pet Cemetery. Here you can download audios I've done for self-guided tours, and they will each take you on a 40 to 45-minute audio tour. It talks about people interred along that route through the cemetery, the bicycle route. Both Laurel Hill East and Laurel Hill West are open currently from 7 a.m. to 5 p.m. We welcome dog walkers, bike riders, photographers, painters, bird watchers, nature buffs, tree and plant lovers, skateboarders, strollers. If you follow us on Instagram and Facebook, you get a daily reminder of our inhabitants and activities. You can also follow All Bones Considered on Instagram and Facebook. And once you've fallen in love with these hotspots, become a friend of Laurel Hill. You'll have the opportunity for several members-only special tours each year, including at least one inside the mausoleum visit. They may be cemeteries, but they are a couple of the liveliest spots in town. The key to finding the gift shop online: click on the support button in the upper right-hand corner, and then the gift shop is over in the left-hand column at the bottom. Again, it's getting close to Christmas time. How about a membership? Get people a membership in Laurel Hill. They can save money on tours. They can save money in the gift shop. And plus, it's just a good thing to do. Make a good donation to the Friends of Laurel Hill for the membership for Friends. Our theme song, Names at Peace, was written and performed by local artist James Harrow. All Bones Considered, Laurel Hill Stories, and biographical bites from Bala, Laurel Hill West stories are mostly research, written, narrated, and produced by me, Joe Lex, retired professor of emergency medicine at Temple University. You can reach me through my email, jrlexjr1947@gmail.com. Remember to keep body and soul together until next time on All Bones Considered, Laurel Hill Stories, where the plot thickens. And until next time we meet, stay safe, stay well, stay above ground.